Everybody, thanks for watching, and welcome to Ancient History Part 2. Now, in this DVD, we really got to get into a lot of the ancient histories dealing with the Ptolemies, because when you look at biblical history, the ones that we know they copied off of, you cannot go into ancient history and not talk about the Ptolemies. So when we get into the Maccabees, which Maccabees is in the Apocrypha, remember in the 1880s they took out about 15 books from the Bible. And in those 15 books, you had Maccabees 1 and 2. And you can find them in the Catholic Bible, but in the King James Version, we went for a long time without having Maccabees and 14 other books of the Bible. So when you start to realize that in Maccabees, it's getting into Alexander and the Ptolemies. So when you start to understand the history, when you start to read Daniel, you can look in Daniel and see that in Daniel, it's talking about the Ptolemies, although in the King James Version, they don't really elaborate on names. You'll get Darius, you'll get Alexander in Maccabees, but not in the King James Version itself. So the whole point is we really have to look at biblical history to see the reason why they kept the Ptolemies out and what all that is really talking about. Okay, now before I forget, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to watch and purchase and support. I have a lot of new upcoming DVDs coming out, more videos on YouTube as well. But we have to really get into this series to kind of bridge the gap between the history of what happened to Kemet and everything that happened after that that led up to the religion that we see today and everything that we see today. So we're going to pick up back with the Ptolemies and really start to understand that history and everything that took place after that, because a lot of people don't realize that the Ptolemies play a huge role in, establishing the civilizations that we see in the so-called Middle East and Europe today. And when you start to look around at what happened and all the wars that was going on, which we'll get into, I mean, everything makes sense as far as why the Greeks were in power and how they was able to create the Torah and biblical religion as we know it. So we're going to get into that. So now, in part one, we talked about Alexander, and when you start to look back at that time in history, and of course we know everything that happened with ancient Kemet and the Persians coming in there and the Greeks coming in there, and the Greeks really establishing themselves in Kemet and having so many years in there to pull out the information. They are the ones that we really have to pay attention to the most. Now it's crazy because there's no way you can be an historian or a researcher and go back in that time and look at the fact that before Kemet fell, you don't see the Greeks, really dressing like the Egyptians and all that stuff that we seen that I showed you guys from the museum. You don't see all that stuff until after the conquest. So it's as if, they was watching and waiting, really being jealous and really waiting to go in there and to be like the Egyptians and have that knowledge. And it seems like, once they took it, they really embellished themselves within that information and really got a lot out of it. But history-wise, when you go into the Bible, again, there's no way you can have these stories about these ancient times and not mention Alexander. You will not see Alexander mentioned in the King James Version, which is the authorized version. This is the version that they gave us. This is important to understand about the King James Version, how you can't just be, crazy with it and just overlook it. You have to really accept this version and why it was given to us, because there's a lot behind it. So when you realize that it does not speak of Alexander in the King James Version, it speaks of Darius, but we don't see nothing about the Ptolemies or Alexander in the King James Version. And as I mentioned before, you have to really know about the Ptolemies if you're talking about biblical history, because they play a huge role. So, as I said, they took out the Apocrypha, or what they call the Deuterocanonical books. The Apocrypha, which is, about 15 books that basically was in between the Old Testament and the New Testament in the King James Version until about, the 1880s when they took it out. Just all of a sudden took out all of these books, and they said that they wasn't really, as close to the other books, meaning they wasn't as divinely inspired as the other books of the Bible, so they removed them. Now, what makes that suspect and why this is important is because you have Maccabees, which we're going to get into first Maccabees, which is where it's talking about Alexander. It's talking about the Ptolemies. It's talking about that time. Now, when you read Daniel, as I was talking about before, it's also talking about the Ptolemies and Alexander, but it does not mention their names, which is really suspect. It's, what's going on. So you can see how, as I showed you in part 1, we found the history. We went back and looked at the fact that the Bible's history, talking about what was going on with the Phoenicians in Tyre, what was going on in those lands during that time, and what really happened when Alexander came in there and destroyed that city. We see the actual proven history differs from what it's talking about in biblical history. They don't even mention Alexander, but we know that whole story has to do with him, but it's not in your Bible. But we can see that they clearly is talking about the same thing. And I showed you in part 1 how they mixed it up, how when we go back and find that the hidden meaning is actually telling you who would come into those lands and conquer it. So you see how they switch it up. It's the same thing. So what a lot of religious people do is they go in, they read the Bible, and the ones who do know history understand about the Ptolemies. So a lot of people pick up on the stories and say, you know what, they're talking about the Ptolemies, even though they don't mention them by name. The issue with that is, if you don't go and look at actual history, a lot of people are believing that the story the Bible is putting out is actually real history, when that's not the case. The case is, if you do not look at actual history and what many historians have, agreed upon, then compare it to the Bible, you won't get the truth. So when people see that, the simple fact that, the story exists and that in real history, you have a story. Difference is when you compare the stories, they are different. One is made to fit the biblical version, and one is the actual history. So you have to believe the actual history over the biblical version that is put there to steal, to implant itself into history to give validity to the Bible. But when you look at the stories and see how they differ, then you find the parable. This is how you can see what it's talking about. So as we got into in part 1, it's basically giving us the rise of the European powers, showing us that they are the bloodline of the so-called beast, Satan or what have you. These are the people who are controlling, and they're giving you these hints. As I talk about with the occult, they want this stuff to come out because it's our consciousness basically absorbing this stuff and getting ready to prepare the consciousness of the world for what's to come as far as biblical prophecy. As I said before, they are using our consciousness to create the reality that they want. So you need to get into these black folks' heads, the people who can control this reality, exactly what's going on and who the culprits are and what the story is, so we can have that in us. But it's wrong history when you start to compare it. So they're giving us exactly what they have done and what's going on. And when you compare it to actual history, you can see what's going on. And the simple fact that it's Greek history just gives you more proof that it was the Greeks, as I have been saying, that are the ones that have created these religions. Now, we had the King James Version, and for about 274 years, the Apocrypha was included within the King James Version. Even if you go and look at the original King James 1611 Bible, it has the Apocrypha in there. For them to take it out in 1885, it's like, for what? Why take it out? Now, if you have a King James Version from that time, from the 1800s, you can look in there and see the Apocrypha in there. And now you have to be like really a skeptic about why take it out. What is the point? Now, for a lot of people, the information was growing in the 1800s. A lot of people understood history, and having those stories in there about Alexander is just outright explaining what happened, telling you who the boogeyman is, who the bad guy is. And since we was freed 1865, black people started to get knowledge and start to understand stuff. It was smart for them to take out those books, to take out the Apocrypha. And this way we wouldn't be able to look at it and then go back and look at history and say, well, wait a minute, this is what really happened. Because now you see people don't care. You know, it don't matter now. They won. It's all done. So they can put the books back in there, which they have done. And you can read about Alexander. They don't care about none of that stuff because the plan worked. Everything happened now. But now you can look at it and start reading about Alexander and Ptolemy and about the wars of the Diadochi, which we're going to get into. And it's like, so what? It's like a story. But when you're trying to get the truth about the validity of the book, of the Bible, and what actually took place, this is what you got to look at. And we're going to get into all of this because it's really important. And I'm going to tell the story about what happened and what took place during that time, during the wars, and why it's really important that we must look at this history. And the reason why I put out this series is because the history is the important part. Because without the history, we're not going to understand what really took place, and we're not going to know why things are the way that it is. It's a huge, gap in between the fall of Kemet and the rise of the European powers as far as biblical supremacy and with the religions and how they used it to basically, put themselves in positions of power. And when I say, it makes so much sense when you understand, and you're really going to get that understanding when I say the consciousness, our consciousness is what helped them do it. So as I said, if you do not possess the necessary tools, the power to create the reality that you want, you have to control the people who can. So once you instill these beliefs into the African people, and then you send them out there to spread the word, because when the Hebrews are talking about the African Hebrews, the African Jews, yeah, of course, as I said, that's true. And they used them to spread that word and to go out and spread this religious consciousness. And they did it, and it stuck and it spread as we can see it, because it's our consciousness that took it in. And since our consciousness is controlling everything and creating this reality, they used it to put themselves in positions of power and use our religious consciousness to infect the rest of the population with religion. So as I said, they could not leave out Alexander. It's just an insult to any real historian who knows about that time for you to go into the Bible and not see anything about Alexander. This is one of the things, like when I talk about, people who actually know history and who actually read the Bible, and them trying to basically put biblical history into actual real history, the fact that he's not in the King James Version should tell you something when you understand actual history. That how could you not put this man in there? How could you not have a definitive long story about him and Julius Caesar? It's like these two people have to be in there. The Ptolemies have to be in there. You have to speak about certain people to really give the validity to what you're speaking about on something of this magnitude. When you're talking about, the Son of God walking the earth and miracles or what have you, how do you leave this dude out? And the more you understand about how much, the Greeks conquered and what they did, it's an insult. And we don't realize it's an insult because we don't know history. We don't know what really took place. And we don't really get it. So we just go with the flow and what we have been brainwashed to believe as far as biblical history. But when you understand, it's how can you not put them in there? But in our Apocrypha, in First Maccabees, says clear as day. It's talking about Alexander. So it says here, this history begins when Alexander the Great, son of Philip of Macedonia, marched from Macedonia and attacked Darius, king of Persia and Media. Alexander enlarged the Greek Empire by defeating Darius and seizing his throne. He fought many battles, captured fortified cities, and put the kings of the region to death. As he advanced to the ends of the earth, he plundered many nations, and when he had conquered the world, he became proud and arrogant by building up a strong army
He dominated whole nations and their rulers and forced everyone to pay him taxes. When Alexander had been emperor for 12 years, he fell ill and realized that he was about to die. He called together his generals, noblemen, who had been brought up with him since his early childhood, and he divided his empire, giving a part to each of them. After his death, the generals took control and each had himself crowned king of his own territory. The descendants of these kings ruled for many generations and brought a great deal of misery on the world. So this is how we understand how Ptolemy I Soter became king of Egypt, who Ptolemy I Soter was one of his generals. And you start to really understand what was going on around that time. So the reason why, we mentioned Game of Thrones in this part is because when we go through this, you're going to understand where they got the whole entire concept from. I mean, when you start reading about this time and this history and what was going on between these generals, between these people who split up these kingdoms and had different lands, you see Game of Thrones. I mean, everything that you see, if you watch Game of Thrones, you're really going to understand this. Everything that you see and what's taking place in Game of Thrones is here. The only thing that is missing is dragons, but not really. Not really. Because when you start to understand that in Daniel, it's talking about dragons, as I pointed out, but also in the Apocrypha, one, we have Maccabees where it's talking about Alexander getting into the Ptolemies, but also part of the Apocrypha, you have the whole story about Bel and the dragons. And in Bel and the Dragons, it's talking about Daniel, which how fitting is talking about Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, it's talking about the Ptolemies. So you do have dragons. And as you get into the story, you're going to have female warriors and you're going to have, the same terminology about king of the north, king of the south, the kingdoms, bending the knee. All of this terminology you hear, you read about when it's talking about ancient Greece and the Ptolemies and everything that happened in the wars of the Diadochi and what took place. It's nowhere around that. Game of Thrones is talking about the Ptolemaic Empire, the Diadochi War, and what was going on back then. Plain and simple. It's nowhere around that to me. The whole thing about Ptolemy being a bastard, same thing with Game of Thrones, all that kind of talk is in the stories when you start reading and getting into it. And as we get into it, you're going to see what I'm talking about, and you can start to point out things. If you're into Game of Thrones, you'll understand exactly what it's saying. So now understand, we're going to get into the story. Now, when Alexander died, of course, the best thing to do, even though he split up the whole territory, started splitting up the kingdoms. And the best thing to do is to try to really take his spot. Everybody knew that when Alexander died, the person who took his spot would be looked at as the true ruler. So even if it was, something that came up with the kingdoms, that they would go to this ruler as being the final decision, the one who has the most power. Because you can't just split up kingdoms and then, have these kingdoms supposed to be full of just Greek people and equal. Somebody still has to rule. Somebody has to be the authority, even though they had kingdoms. So, of course, you're the ruler in your kingdom, but really, the person who would replace Alexander would be looked at as the true king. So, a lot of people tried to marry Cleopatra, his sister, when he died. And one of the things you'll understand, do not get caught up in the names. There are many Cleopatras. A lot of people they got this idea that it's one Cleopatra. It's many Cleopatras. There are many Alexanders. There are many Ptolemies. When you start getting into the stories, you'll understand that these names get passed down. Which is why you have Ptolemy the first, second, what have you. Alexander the first, second, fourth, or what have you. Same thing with Cleopatra. So don't get caught up in the names. There's more than one Cleopatra. So a lot of people tried to marry Cleopatra to, get that marriage going so they can kind of sort of be the one who was looked at as the main king on the throne. Now, it was rumored that Cleopatra was going to marry Perdiccas, who was one of Alexander's generals. Now, this was a rumor. Now, a lot of people really thought that they actually got married, but it wasn't true. But in any case, the rest of the Diadochi, which Diadochi means successor. So you have the wars of the Diadochi, the wars of the successors of Alexander the Great, basically what it translates as. So, of course, since people hearing this stuff, the other kings, seeing that Perdiccas would probably marry Cleopatra, they came together against Perdiccas. And, even though it wasn't so, but Cleopatra remained single for a while, of course. And the whole thing was when Alexander died, if you remember the story, you understand his brother, Aridaeus, who was his older half brother, was supposed to take the throne. But he was mentally ill. He was slow. He basically was, mentally unfit to rule the kingdom. And, Alexander understood this. He kept Aridaeus with him and took him out to many battles. He kept him by his side. It was his brother. He actually loved his brother a lot. But he knew he was weak and that he was feeble-minded. He wasn't really there 100%. So Alexander wasn't really worried about him. So now Perdiccas was actually named the regent of the kingdom of Alexander the Great. So since they looked at it and said that, well, this dude is slow, we can't really put him as the ruler. We have to elect a regent, which a regent basically means somebody who's going to basically be ruling in place until the heir becomes of age. Because remember, Alexander's wife, Roxana, was pregnant. And the whole thing was, would she produce a man or a woman? So that was huge. Everybody would sit back and wait till she had the baby to see if it was going to be a male heir, which would be king eventually, or girl. So they basically named Aridaeus as ruler. And it was a boy that she had, Alexander IV. They named them two as basically the rulers of the land, basically in name only, like they would be like symbolic rulers, like monarchy, you might as well say. But the power would basically lie with Perdiccas, and he would be the one who basically rules and really has the say-so on what takes place until Alexander IV became of age. So, of course, everybody's looking at Perdiccas as the true ruler. What he says goes. Of course, the other Diadochi, which you have to understand, you really have four main ones, but it's more who would later come into power. So we can't really stick to the main four, one being Ptolemy the First Soter and Perdiccas, of course. There's a lot more who would eventually come into power. And this whole war, this whole Game of Thrones, would take place. So understand again, you have now Perdiccas ruling. And now everybody's looking at Perdiccas, wanting that spot, and paying attention to what he's doing and what's going on. The thing is, as I said, Game of Thrones type stuff has happened. You have to understand, you have now Aridaeus, who was the older half brother of Alexander the Great. They are both sons of Philip of Macedonia, who was basically ruling before. Now, what you have to understand is that Philip of Macedonia, his brother was the king, and his brother had a son. Now, of course, when the king dies, the prince rules. The heir is supposed to take over. That's how they was doing it in Greece. But, when Philip's brother died, his son was basically an infant, a baby, a child, so could not rule. So Philip of Macedonia became the regent, just like Perdiccas just became the regent. So you have Philip of Macedonia being the regent now, and the heir, waiting for the heir to come of age is what he's supposed to do, and then, turn over the kingdom to him. So basically, Philip of Macedonia was supposed to turn over the kingdom to his nephew, Amyntas. But instead of turning over the kingdom, what he did was declare himself king. Forget being regent. I'm going to declare myself king. And that's what he did. He declared himself king. Amyntas came of age, but Amyntas wasn't really, in a position to challenge the throne, even though he is rightfully his. He didn't really challenge it. He didn't really, care too much about it. He didn't really try to be a threat or a problem to Philip of Macedonia. He just basically conceded. And what Philip did was, when he had his daughter, he gave his daughter to his nephew. Remember, that's just how they do in these royal families, their bloodline. So he gave his daughter, Kenene, which a lot of you know who she is. We'll get into that in a second. Kenene, he gave Kenene to his nephew to basically marry her and basically go about their business. Now, the whole thing was Alexander was born, of course. Now, Alexander is coming up, and Alexander knows that he has basically somebody who can challenge him for the throne once his father dies. And he didn't like that. So he did what any, person would do in that position. He went and he killed her husband. And he basically promised her that he would give her another husband, a powerful husband someday. So he didn't want nobody to challenge him for the throne. So he went and killed his cousin. So now you have later, after Alexander dies, what happens was before he died, he promised his sister that, she would marry this powerful lieutenant. Oh, I forget his name, but he was a guy who really helped out Alexander throughout his whole rulership. And he was really loyal to Alexander, so he wanted to reward him with marrying his sister. But he got sick and he died before that could even happen. Now, again, we have fast forward to where now you have Perdiccas being the regent and running the kingdom in Alexander's place. So Kenene, who is a powerful warrior, she is very powerful, and she understands that she would have been queen at some point and would have been ruling had her husband been alive. That would have been able to take his place. So now she doesn't have a husband to step into that place or anything like that. So she focused her time on her daughter. Now, Kenene, as I said, was a warrior. She commanded armies. She was no joke. She defeated the Illyrian army and she killed the queen, with her own hands. Everybody knew about her. She was very well respected. Now, she had plans of her own. She had a daughter, Eurydice, who she wanted to marry to her uncle, who was the one who was slow, Aridaeus, who was her brother. So she wanted her daughter to marry her brother, which would be her uncle, her daughter's uncle. So her plan was to go ahead, take her daughter to Macedonia to marry her uncle, and basically she would have, some stake on the throne that was basically stolen away from her by her brother. So her proposal was she was going to go there, make it happen. And because she had respect and people liked her, it probably would have happened. So on her way there, of course, you had Perdiccas, who understood that if I let her, who is really a rightful heir to the throne, instill some kind of power in the kingdom, it would create problems for him. She would be watching his every move. So what he did was he went and sent his brother out to intercept her on her way there. And he ended up killing Kenene, who was a great warrior. He ended up killing her. Don't know exactly how, but he got the job done. And he killed her. So because she had so much respect, and a lot of people really respected her and revered her, and she was a good warrior, it kind of backfired on her. Because the council basically ruled that Eurydice, her daughter, could still go ahead and marry her uncle, Aridaeus. Even though he was slow, he wasn't that slow. He can, sort of comprehend a little bit, but he wasn't really mentally fit enough to run an entire kingdom. But she went on ahead and married her uncle, and they got married. And now, of course, she was basically, trying to really pull his strings and control his little bit of power that he did have, which of course she wanted him to have more power he had, she had. So this was her game to really try to get his level up and to get the council and the people to recognize that he is a true heir. Even though he's slow, he deserves the respect of having more power than what he had. So Eurydice will eventually marry her uncle, Aridaeus, but Aridaeus would change his name to Philip III. So Aridaeus would become Philip III. He would marry his niece, Eurydice, and they would basically become a small power in the Macedonian Empire, which of course Perdiccas definitely feared and did not like. And he knew he had to eventually do something about that. So what happened was you had Perdiccas, who was sending out Alexander the Great's body. Now understand this whole marriage and everything that happened, all this stuff happened within the same year Alexander died, the marriage and everything. So you had a little bit later, you had Perdiccas sending out the body of Alexander the Great to basically go be buried where he was crowned king. So right where he was crowned king, his body was supposed to be buried. But remember, as I said, the other Diadochi was against him, one of them being Ptolemy I Soter. What Ptolemy I Soter did was go and steal the body from the men who was transporting Alexander's body. So now after he stole Alexander's body, it was buried in Alexandria, Egypt, which we know Ptolemy I Soter was the one who was crowned king or pharaoh of Egypt. So, of course, after he stole the body, Perdiccas wasn't having that. So he basically set up an army to basically go in and invade Egypt and start a war with Ptolemy I Soter. So here you have two of the Diadochi, two Greek warriors, soldiers in the army of Alexander who started the fight against each other, And you had this war start to break out. The problem was Perdiccas wasn't as sharp as Ptolemy, and he was arrogant and he was crazy. So his battle plans, his military strategy was whack. He couldn't even cross the Nile and get into the main areas where he needed to strike. And his battle plans and his strategy was horrible. And every time his men failed, he would, execute them. He would treat them like crap. And eventually they got tired of it. So what happened was a few of his lieutenants, his leaders, came together and basically ended up killing him. So here you have the regent, basically almost the king almost, who is in place of Alexander. And this dude invades Egypt, which kind of pissed everybody else off. Then he wasn't even able to make a dent into Egypt. And he was basically killing off his own men because of his incompetence. And his generals and his commanders and what have you, they just didn't like it. It was disrespectful. And they basically came together and they ended up killing him. So basically one of those commanders was Seleucus. And Seleucus would eventually get some land of his own and begin the Seleucid Empire. Anybody who does any research on ancient history know about the Seleucid Empire. You can't miss it. So understand that's where that comes into play. And again, so much history, as I said, that you start breaking down once you understand just this part in these stories. So the whole Seleucid Empire came about because Seleucus was one of the commanders that killed Perdiccas, one of the first, or considered the first Diadochi successor of Alexander the Great. And so the successor, the Diadochi War, began. And once Perdiccas was killed, of course, you had Eurydice pushing for her husband, to be in power, to get more powers. And a lot of people thought that might happen, but of course it didn't, because of course he was slow and they didn't want to give him anything he really couldn't handle. So what happened was you had one of Philip of Macedonia, Alexander's father. You had one of his old lieutenants basically end up being voted in as being the new regent. So now Perdiccas is dead, and you have one of the lieutenants of Philip of Macedonia taking over as the regent. Now you would think, with Philip being, so old and dying a long time ago, anybody who served with him would be old. So Antipater, who was the lieutenant who served with Philip of Macedonia, he became regent. Now, he wasn't regent for long because he died of natural causes, soon after. So everybody assumed that his son, Cassander, would take the place as regent. Because again, that's how things usually go. Your son succeeds you, becomes your successor. And Cassander thought that he would take the place if something happened to his father. And you had Eurydice, and you had her husband, who was her uncle. Gonna keep pointing that out because it's crazy. You had Eurydice and her uncle, Philip III, basically push for Cassander to be the new regent of Macedonia. Cassander had already aligned himself with Ptolemy I Soter and the other Diadochi, who was against Perdiccas. So, once he didn't get named ruler or regent, he was upset. Now, what happened was, instead of Cassander, son of Antipater, once he didn't get named, as I say, he was upset. A lot of people assumed he would get named, but what happened was you had Polypertian, who was a friend of Antipater, one of his friends. He got named as the regent because he was, closest to the king and he knew how to rule. And Cassander wasn't really looked at as a person who was really, ready to rule. So you had Polypertian take over as regent, which pissed Cassander off, and a civil war began between Polypertian and Cassander. And basically, Polypertian was shocked that Cassander amassed the type of warriors that he did, because of course he was in with Ptolemy I Soter and the other Diadochi to basically, have this allegiance for one of them being, on the main throne. So when you look at the whole thing, you got to look at the seat of Alexander being the seat of power. So when you look at the 7 kingdoms in Game of Thrones, and you look at the fact that the Targaryen kingdom was like the main kingdom, they had the dragons, and there was the main kingdom over the 7 kingdoms and over really basically everything else. So whoever ruled that kingdom was considered, the ruler of the rest of the kingdoms. It's basically the same thing here in Greece. Whoever ruled Macedonia, whoever ruled the place in place of Alexander will be considered, the king of everything else. So they wanted it to be one of them, of course. So when you had Polypertian take over, Cassander go to war with him, and Cassander basically get help and have Ptolemy I Soter and Antigonus, which Antigonus was the one who basically destroyed the fleet of Polypertian. You had them come together and basically help him defeat Polypertian, which he fled, and eventually Cassander would basically try to take the throne. So now Polypertian was smart. He basically fled to Olympias, whatever Alexander's mother's name, how do you pronounce it? Olympias. He fled to her, and he fled to Roxana and Alexander IV, who was Alexander the Great's son, who was the heir in waiting, So he fled there and basically pled to Olympias and said, hey, Cassander's taken over. This isn't the way it's supposed to go. Basically help him out. And what Olympias did, because she was powerful as well, she could fight. She had an army, and he basically got together the men that he had left who was willing to fight for him, and they amassed the army. While Cassander was away, they basically went back into Macedonia and defeated the army there and basically took back the kingdom. So you had Olympias go in there, and remember, now you have Olympias there, but who's also there is Eurydice and Philip III, named after her husband. So she understood that Philip III was being used, and as long as he was alive, he was a threat to the kingdom, so he had to go. So she killed him. She had him executed, and she forced Eurydice to commit suicide. So Philip III of Macedonia was executed 317 BCE, and his wife Eurydice was forced to commit suicide, and Olympus basically assumed control of the kingdom for a while. And she was basically, going on a rampage and killing everybody who she thought was a threat. She killed Cassander's brother, all of Cassandra's commanders and his soldiers that was there. She executed a lot of them. And, you know, she basically held on to the place for a while, I think over a year, until she was basically ambushed. She was basically caught in a blockade in Pitna. And Cassandra caught her in a blockade and basically forced her to surrender. And he told her, you know, if you surrender, then, you know, you can keep your life. I'll let you live if you surrender. She surrendered, and of course, he didn't keep his word, but he ordered a bunch of soldiers to execute her, which they didn't do it. They didn't want to do it. Nobody wanted to be known as the person that killed Alexander's mother, so that was tough. So what he did was he got the family members of all the people that she executed, got her enemies, got everybody together, and they stoned her to death. Stoned her to death. And now Cassandra understood the only people that was in the way of him taking the throne was Alexander's son, Alexander IV, and his mother Roxana. So what he did, I believe it was 309 BCE, when Alexander IV was 14 and getting ready to come into age of being crowned king, he had them both poisoned. Poisoned them both. And you can look at it just like in Game of Thrones when Joffrey, the boy king, was poisoned. It's the same thing. You had Alexander IV poisoned at like 14. I think Joffrey was like older, like 19, something like that in Game of Thrones. But this is where the story is coming from. It's the same thing. All this stuff is coming from the same place. And this is what they do. They know how to take stories and actual history and then manipulate them. Manipulate the stories and plagiarize the stories to create something that they want to put out. But it's important that you know the story, which is why I'm telling it, because it's important you understand what happened and the kind of things that was taking place within those kingdoms. So you can see how unstable things was. You know, so it's crazy. So eventually, you know, Cassandra would crown himself king and take the throne and would rule for a while. So now we go back and you look at the only person left, as I mentioned before, was Cleopatra. Cleopatra was left, and the only person left that somebody could marry that could tie them to the throne and have some kind of stake in being, you know, a true ruler or a person that had some kind of true claim to the throne. So you had Cleopatra eventually accept a proposal from Ptolemy I Soter to marry. But before she can get married, she was caught by Antigonus and she was killed. So again, you know, this stuff kept happening. You had these wars. Nobody wanted anybody to really lay claim to the throne of Alexander unless it was them. So it was going to always be a war. Even people who allied, who they thought they was allies, they was going to fight. It was always going to be a battle for that throne, because that throne would be the throne to rule the rest of the thrones. And they all knew that. So you had, you know, this time what a lot of people don't realize about Hellenization. When you have these empires that's basically controlling, you know, Egypt, the Middle East, Greece, so much land. This is the real Hellenization, because now you got all these Greeks in control of all of these kingdoms. And now they're spreading the language and the customs of the Greeks, which is why everybody spoke Greek around then. Everybody was speaking Greek because the Greeks ruled that whole area. Once you understand that, it's very easy for you to see how they could be the ones who created the Bible. It's not hard. See, the reason why the Hebrews are having trouble putting this together, as well as other Christians, is because they don't look at the history. They don't know what happened. When you understand that these people in the Seleucid Empire, the Egyptian Empire, the Roman Empire, which would later come, because during this time, while the Greeks are fighting each other, you have the Romans, you know, building and basically breeding these cock diesel warriors getting ready for battle, because they see that while y'all fighting against each other, we're going to step in and take over. At the same time, you have the Persian Empire regaining strength, looking at the same thing. The Greeks keep fighting each other, killing each other. We need to just go in there and take this stuff from them because they can't get together and appreciate what they have. But with Hellenization, this is what you have. You have all these Greeks in these territories taking over, instilling Greek language, laws and rules and what have you. And it's very easy to see how they was able to do what they did. So we can see this stuff in the Bible, as we're going to get into. When you start to understand the stories and what took place, you have Antiochus II. Antiochus II was married to Laodice, and they got into war, of course, with the Ptolemies. Now, Antiochus II ruled Syria, and Antiochus, the first, or Antiochus was the one who discovered Antioch in Syria, what have you, different story. But they got into it with Ptolemy, or Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. You can say Ptolemy, I say Ptolemy, it's just a thing, but it's pronounced Ptolemy. But they got into a war, and basically to settle the war, Ptolemy agreed to give his daughter to Antiochus II, who was already married. It's like, how are you going to give me a wife when I got a wife already? But to keep things, peaceful, he gave up his daughter, Berenice. He gave up his daughter to Antiochus II. He divorced his wife, Laodice, married Berenice with the understanding that whatever children that they had would eventually rule. So now, Laodice and Antiochus II already had a child, Seleucus II. But now you can see that when you get into the story, when you understand that, and you start reading in Daniel, you can see where that story fits in Daniel. You can see what Daniel is talking about. So now when you read Daniel 11:6, it says, "And in the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come unto the king of the north to make an agreement," the agreement I just told you about. "But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begot her, and he that strengthened her in these times." So now it's talking about, as I said, the daughter of the king of the south, which would be Berenice. The king of the south would be Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. The king of the north would be Antiochus II. Now, when it's saying that she will not retain the power of the arm, now what happened was you had Berenice and Antiochus II actually end up having a child, which that child, according to the agreement that it's speaking about, will be the heir. So now, unfortunately for Berenice, once they had a child, it somehow made Laodice, who is his real wife, he and Laodice basically came back together. They got back together once that child was conceived, and once that child was born, it brought them two back together closer. And what Laodice ended up doing, she actually killed the child of Berenice and her husband, Antiochus II. She ended up killing the child and killing Berenice. So when it says, "Neither shall he stand," well, after that, he died. So now what's left is her and her son, Seleucus II, that she had with Antiochus II. And it says, "But she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begot her, and he that strengthened her in these times." So not only did Laodice kill, their son and Berenice, but she killed the midwives, not the midwives, but basically like her caretakers that basically brought her into this world and took care of her and raised her. She killed them as well. And we know her, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, ended up dying. And, of course, who strengthened her was Antiochus II, and he ended up dying. And what happened later, as I said, Seleucus II will take the throne along with his mother, Laodice. So you have it right in the Bible, and when you understand the history and what it's talking about the Ptolemies. Without me even getting too much into it, all you got to do is read Daniel and listen to what Daniel was talking about, and it's telling the stories, talking about Darius, and the story, the whole thing in Daniel, starting into Daniel 11, is talking about the Ptolemies, it's talking about Alexander and everything that was going on during that time. Clear as day. But they just don't use the names. But when you know the story and you know the history, you can match it up and see exactly what they're talking about. Because you can't make this stuff up. You can't just put it in there. You have to somehow attach it to real history to where people can actually see it. People can actually, make a connection that will make the stuff seem legitimate. So even when you start seeing this stuff talking about the whole story and the agreement, and that, the king of the south and the king of the north, the king of the south's daughter will basically go up to the king of the north. I mean, not too many people will even understand that. What does that mean? What are you talking about? Who are you talking about? But when you understand that history and what we're talking about, then you know what they're talking about. So now you have Daniel 11:7 saying, "But out of the branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail." So when it's saying out of the branches of her roots, it's talking about her own son, who will rise up in the king of the north, which will be in the kingdom of Antiochus II, and he shall prevail. It's giving you the Ptolemies, it's giving you Antiochus II, it's giving you this story of what happened in Greek history and is in the Bible. And it's hard for you to really understand it because they don't really put names. If they actually put the names in there, in Daniel, we would have understood this stuff for a long time. But instead, by them taking out Maccabees and taking out the whole Deuterocanonical books, the whole Apocrypha, and us not getting this understanding, we are left to piece it together. So now, you're looking at all this history, and you're seeing what's going on with the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire with Antiochus II, and nothing about the Jews. Nothing about the Jews before the 4th century BCE. So when you start getting into this time where after Ptolemy had basically taken Alexander's body and began to basically the wars of the Diadochi, and you had this fighting going on, and during this whole time that we have Hellenization, that you hear nothing about any Jews or any Hebrews until after the 4th century BCE, when they began to establish this whole deception. And that's the thing, how you have this history being explained in this war that's going on. And during this time, the Hebrews or the Israelites supposed to have been doing their thing. But somehow in Israel, which Israel would be part of the Seleucid Empire during that time, nothing. So you would think that if there was God's chosen people and the Bible was true, what have you, they would not have been gone through what they went through during that time. And definitely the Greeks wouldn't be ruling Israel during that time. So that's the whole thing. And that's one of the things they don't really get into, is explaining the Greeks ruling. This is the part they really want to cover up the most. Because when you start to look at the real history, it's going to point straight to them. And you have to ask yourself that question, where's the Jews? Where's the Jews in all this thing? What's going on? That we're reading all these stories in this whole Game of Thrones, and the Jews don't come into play and no place. So you're going to read in First Maccabees about the persecution of the Jews and, all this stuff about the Jews. And it seems like, and this is like 2nd century BCE around this time when they started to put the stuff into place. And the only reason why they have this in Maccabees about the Jews is to, again, put themselves into history, to try to force themselves in there. So we know the only reason why it will be any problem with the Jews in that territory will be because any type of persecution will be because it's them trying to force Judaism on the Africans that was there. That's why they mention it, because it's well known that they didn't just, of course, lay down and take it. You had a war. You had these Africans go to war with the Greeks, of course, and they lost. And eventually, once, time set in and the people who was fighting the war is dead and gone or ran off, the people that's left, you indoctrinate them. And you do that by generation. So once you teach that first generation and they know it, they pass it down. It's the same thing they did to us later in slavery. Start passing down the information. It just became normal. So you have these Africans eventually accept being Jews, Hebrews, and begin to start passing this information down until eventually they will be completely, wiped out of Israel. Will only be a few left. And the ones that was really into the religion and had high places would go out and teach the religion to other Africans, and it was spread until the Arabs came and basically took over and forced everybody to scatter, and they would eventually take a lot of these Jews, a lot of these Africans, and convert them to Islam. It's the same type thing. So we had this Judaism push, and it fulfilled its agenda. Its purpose was fulfilled as far as getting the information out there and planting it and passing it down to not just African civilizations, but to the so-called the Arabs and the mixed Berber around that time, because there was a lot of mixing going on, and to create this whole fictitious, fake Judaism when the Arabs came in and began mixing with the Greeks. But, when you look at the war, we start to step back, we see that the Ptolemies would prevail and began to take over much of that territory. In fact, when you go to First Maccabees 11:13, it says, "Then Ptolemy entered Antioch and assumed the crown of Syria. So he wore both the crown of Egypt and the crown of Syria." Here you have it clearly mentioning Ptolemy's name. But remember, this is in First Maccabees, one of the Apocrypha books that is not in the King James Version that you probably have at church, unless you got an older version or you have a version where they specifically say that it has the Apocrypha put in. And a lot of people know that when you grew up, that common King James Version that we grew up with did not have the Apocrypha in it. And even if it did, we didn't know what the hell it was anyway. So when Ptolemy did rule both kingdoms, Egypt and Syria, we know what it says later. He was fighting against another Alexander, and he defeated him. Now Alexander fled into the Arab territories, and Arabs basically caught him and cut his head off and sent it back to the Ptolemies. But Ptolemy died like a couple of days later, like 3 days after that. And you had Demetrius take the throne, and again, war all over again. And you had this type of stuff happen over and over. So what would eventually happen, we know that Rome got their stuff together and basically went to war with Greece. I think it was about 49 BCE where Julius Caesar, began to rule. That happened in Rome, and Greece would join, had a whole Greco-Roman era. And so the stability began to fall in place for the Romans and the Greeks. And to me, that was somebody with knowledge, understanding that they needed to focus more on the Africans and come together and stop fighting against each other, and understand how powerful we were and what we could do. So you had them come together. You had, during this whole time with the Diadochi War, you had Rome basically being ruled by Africans, being controlled by Africans, and eventually the Aryans would come in, and you had a dual system of Africans and Aryans, black and white people, ruling and living together fine, with no problem. And meanwhile, you had the leadership, whoever was there, plotting to take over and overthrow the African rulership in Rome, which is what they end up doing. Plain and simple. The barbarians took over, and as I said before, when Rome fell, and people say that's the reason why, we had the Dark Ages, because Rome fell, but no. Rome fell, and Rome falling was the fall of the African leadership in Rome, as I said, and the rise of the European powers. And they amassed an army large enough, and we don't even know if they really fought or if they was on each other's side the whole time. We don't really know. We just know they came together, the Greco-Roman era. And remember, the Romans continued Hellenization and let the Greeks stay in the positions that they was, and even had the Greeks write the New Testament. Remember, it's written in Greek. So, who knows what really happened? The Roman Empire could have been the Greek Empire the whole time. We don't know. We just got to go by the little breadcrumbs of history that they leave us. But when you use common sense, it kind of, it kind of doesn't work out. But that's what happened. So we had, as I said before, the Roman Empire would rise. But during that time, the Persian Empire was gaining, steam, and would eventually go head to head with the Roman Empire after they had laid claim to the lands that they took. And that battle would last up into the 7th century AD or CE. And remember, as I said, ended in the status quo antebellum, with Islam being created after that. And we know that the Moors made a deal with them as well to basically take over these African territories. Because as I said, they had to turn their attention to the Africans, because after all this war and fighting that was going on, they turned and looked and saw kingdoms rise up in Africa. And Africans have wealth and knowledge. They fighting and killing each other for hundreds of years for this power, for these thrones, for this information. And here you have the Africans start popping up with kingdoms all over Africa with knowledge, making money, and doing amazing things. And they had to focus their self on us and come together to conquer and take what we had, so that we won't use the knowledge that was rightfully ours to establish a more powerful kingdom on the planet. Now understand, we had already outnumbered them like crazy. Our problem was we wasn't united, and they was. That's why we fell. Because they got their shit together and got united. We wasn't looking at it as a black-white thing. They was looking at it as a white thing, a power thing, and using that to their advantage as far as getting in positions, making themselves look weak and like they wanted to learn or what have you, and, being really good spies and moles. And it will eventually bring down many African kingdoms. So we're going to get into, of course, in part 3, we really got to get into the Roman Empire and their rise, and the Africans that ruled their territory, and how Christianity was instilled and brought up. So we'll get into that eventually. But it's important to understand the Ptolemaic era and what happened during that time. So again, you have to ask yourself, why would they leave this stuff out of the Bible? Why wasn't we taught this stuff, in history class? Why would they leave all these stories, this whole entire history that I just gave you? A lot of you don't know about, never heard of before. And the movies didn't tell it all and tell it like it was. Why would they leave it out? And of course, you got to look at the fact, as I showed you in Daniel, clearly talked about the Ptolemies and what happened. Don't use the names. But we know it's talking about the Ptolemies. But you got to think about it. Wasn't the Old Testament supposed to be written in Hebrew? Supposed to be written in Hebrew, right? Why is it Daniel is an Old Testament book? So it's supposed to be written by the Hebrews. Why would the Hebrews know that story? How would the Hebrews know that story to write it? Think about that. So they're supposed to have been there and witnessed all this stuff that I just talked about and put it in Daniel. The whole war against the king of the south, king of the north, the agreement. How would they know that? And of course, biblical people would say, well, the Lord told them that. So the Lord told them all that, to write all that, but they somehow can't fit themselves in the story. So basically it was just some Hebrew or Jew around hiding, writing this stuff, or people won't believe that God gave them that story and told them to just write it out. And this is how biblical people think, or religious people think, I should say. I think that God just put this story in their head. But if that's so, it's incorrect. We know when you read the whole thing, it's not saying the exact same thing as what happened in history. So we can't use that as well. But it goes to show, since we know we got the Septuagint Greek, and that the Greeks wrote it because it's their history, it makes a lot more sense. Why would Hebrews even put that in their law? Because remember, the Torah is supposed to be their law, their story, their laws, the laws of Moses and what have you. Why is this Greek stuff in there? So this information is for you to help put together the pieces, for you to help put together these pieces. Because now when you start to listen to it, you can really see exactly what happened and how after Kemet fell exactly what was going on and how they got into these positions. Now, I showed you before when I went to the Cairo Museum in Cairo, and now it makes a lot more sense when you go through that video and you see how, one, as I said, they tried to copy off of Kemet. You had Zeus Amon, you had Serapis, and we can see exactly what was going on. You can see how they start changing their culture into Egyptian culture with the stelas and everything else, dressing like the Egyptians and decreeing themselves as, pharaohs or what have you. Plain and simple. It's like so much corny, like a joke. It's embarrassing to me, if I was a Greek, to see them do that. Like, where is your own culture? And it's crazy how you have this Greek culture that's supposed to be so proud, and they got Zeus and what have you and everything like that. But as soon as they conquered Kemet, they took the Egyptian culture because they knew it was the truth. And they knew their culture was based off of Egyptian culture anyway, but they wanted to deal with the Egyptian knowledge and not their own. So they really tried to push their beliefs on the Egyptians in Israel to try to get those generations to take that information while they take the Egyptian information. They wanted to switch places. And this is basically what they have effectively done. When you pay attention to what's going on and how they do is, we have switched places. They took our knowledge and turned us into who they was, not having knowledge. They was looking up to us as being the knowledgeable ones, the people who had all the knowledge. Now we looking up to them. We was sophisticated, refined with wealth. Now they are sophisticated, refined with wealth, and we are in a low state like they was. Plain and simple. So they have reversed the roles throughout history and been trying to put us in their place while they take ours. I mean, I see that happening today, even still, with people who don't even understand how they sound so much like white folks. As I talked about before, you go back in the 1970s and 80s, black people are not going to kill a 17-year-old black child over some stuff in the house. Over some material possessions. They're going to catch him and beat his ass and take him to his mom. They're not going to say, well, I would have killed that nigga too. Why would you even say that? That tells you, as I said, they're reversing the roles. That's something a racist white man would say, oh, kill that thieving nigger. Now you got black people saying that over some stuff in the house, that they would kill a young black man. They're reversing the roles. They have been doing it throughout history. And when you understand history, you can see exactly what they did and what they're doing and why they're doing it. So, as we know, they have to write themselves into history, and they have to justify all of the stelas, all of the reliefs that's in Kemet. There's Philip III, Aridaeus, his relief in Karnak, because you're going to find them in Kemet a lot, in a lot of reliefs, a lot of carvings on the wall, because they wanted to beat us so bad when they got this information. And the Egyptians wouldn't have it. And it's basically what it was. It wasn't like the Egyptians was just going to basically, accept it. I mean, how could you accept it? If somebody just walked into your home, killed your parents and then tried to be your parents, you're going to fight every chance you get. It's like, how are you going to kill one person and try to take their place? Start wearing their clothes, trying to sound like them, talk like them, boss you around. You're not my parents. Who are you? And this is what they was doing. And the Egyptian people wasn't accepting it. So they use, generations. It's like generational corruption. And again, if this generation pass away, the kids, whatever the kids know, all of us adults, when we gone, that's what's going to be at the forefront. So you don't really worry about the adults, you go after the kids, and they still have that whole thing in place today. They're not worried about us. They want the kids. Plain and simple. So we're going to be gone soon. The kids is going to have the information that they have, and they're going to go run with it. So if you're implanting in the kids' head when they go to school that, Serapis is God and Ptolemy the First Soter was a god, and, you're a Jew or you're a Hebrew, and this is why this happened to you or what have you. The kids are going to grow up with this information, and they're going to pass it down, and it's just going to stick, and it's going to become, fact. It's going to become history. And everybody who know the truth going to be dead and gone, except for the people at the top who instilled it and who is enforcing this truth. And then even the people that's going to come and enforce it later are going to believe that it's actually true, not knowing, the real history. They're going to believe that it's true, and that the reason why that they have their job is to make sure that it's enforced. So they had to really, really, get this information pounded into the children's heads so they can pass it down. They allowed Egypt to be covered in sand to cover their tracks. They made sure that the Arabs took over Kemet, so we don't take it over and understand who he is and everything like that. They made sure. You got to think about it. They could have defeated the Arabs and taken Kemet from them, but they got everything out of it. They let the Arabs take it, and that's where they wanted to be there. As long as we're not there, they can't be there. Think about Egypt. Think about how much they try to be like us so much. How much they try to claim Egypt. We see it all the time. We see it in the movies. They want to claim that Kemet was white and that the ancient Egyptians was white. Wouldn't it be better if you're actually there to do so? You don't see the Arabs coming out claiming that, all that stuff and the pyramids and everything that's there, they build. You have some ignorant Arabs that might say that, but when you go there, especially when you go to the pyramids, they'll tell you straight up, no, these are your ancestors, as I pointed out when I was there. They call you Nubian, they call you Pharaoh, they call the women's queens, Nubians or what have you, and say, welcome home. This is exactly what I experienced in my times in Kemet, and that's how they talk to you, as if Kemet is yours. But think about how the Europeans try to take it, and they want it so bad. Why not just take the land? And we know they can't take it because they can't survive there. You can't have a society in ancient Kemet that's full of white folks. They would die. There's no way they could survive there as a civilization, so they would rather it go into the hands of the Arabs than for the Africans to take it and understand their true history and who they are. This is a common sense thing that just shows you it's more to us, because it's no way in the world that anybody would believe that that land is theirs. And the Arabs themselves is telling you that it's ours. And unless you go there, or unless you really pay attention, you won't see that. So we know it's bullshit, but they own the mainstream media and everything like that, so they can say what they want. Because, when it comes to the news, people believe it. But common sense and facts, when you go there and pay attention, you see who the people is and who the country actually belong to. But the key thing you got to really pay attention to, as I said, is just to look at how they went to war with each other. The Diadochi War, and how they killed each other and what they was willing to do to assume the throne. I mean, one of the reasons why Game of Thrones is ending, because there's not much more to tell. It's not much more to tell. You can end it however you're going to end it, but that's basically how, it ends for real. Eventually they stay in power and they keep going. So just imagine the Lannisters winning in Game of Thrones, and then that's it. All the dragons are gone. People are, not happy, and the Lannisters win, and then life just go on. That's basically what happened. So it's interesting to see how Game of Thrones is going to end, but it shouldn't end the right way. But it probably will, because that's how they get us with the movies. But in real life, if you want to look at it that way, the Lannisters win, and it is what it is. But it's no reason for them to continue it, because they basically told the entire story, and they don't have any more history they can put into it to keep it going. Like, a lot of people don't understand when they put out a lot of these movies that seem to be good, or a lot of these TV shows that seem to be good. They're telling their story and getting out. And only the people who understand the esoteric meaning is going to get it. Look at V. Even with V, the whole thing with the reptilians and everything coming to Earth and all that, why did that end? Well, that was a good series. What happened? How could you take that off? One, it was revealing too much, but two, it's like, what more can you say? You can't give away too much. But it's like, again, you had that series. It was another series that came out that was good. It's a couple of these series that was coming out that was really good and had a lot of insight that was just, taken off the air. So the Ptolemaic Empire, you see it a lot. You hear about it a lot when you actually dig into this stuff. But it's something that they just don't put out there. I mean, for this kind of dynasty, you would expect them to have movies, TV specials. They talk about Hitler a lot. Hitler ain't got nothing on the Ptolemies. Everywhere you look, it's Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. Nothing on the Ptolemies. Nothing about that time. You get the little movies, 300 and all that type of stuff dealing with the Greeks or what have you, but you don't get nothing on the Ptolemies. You don't see nothing about the Diadochi War, the War of the Successors, and really a real true, story about Alexander and everything that really took place in history. And we don't even get movies on the establishment of, the Jewish power. They give us the biblical explanation of how it came about. And the fact that it doesn't fit right into actual history. And this is stuff it's important history for those of you who understand to piece this in and really get it. And really get where this stuff fits at. Because it's that gap that a lot of people just don't understand this information. And a lot of people don't know where to look to find it. Because when you start reading in the Bible, especially if you are smart enough to comprehend that Daniel was talking about Alexander the Ptolemies, then a lot of people look at that as actual history and don't go back and look at the real history to make that connection. But when you go back and look at the real history, you can see that it's different from the Bible and why. It's important to backtrack that Ptolemaic era to Kemet to make the connection of how they created the Torah and why, how they was able to do it and the fact that nobody else could have done it. Ain't no Jews running around pushing, the Torah and doing all these wars and fighting the Amalekites and the Girgashites and the Perishites and the Jebusites and all that stuff. Where this stuff is at? When did this happen? Because it's supposed to have been all BC time. But how could it happen in territories that was run by the Greeks? Doesn't make sense. So as I talked about before and I pointed out, when it's talking about the whole Jewish war that Josephus talks about, when you have the Jews basically go ahead and attack the Romans. Again, as I said, these were African Jews that was attacking the Romans, attacking Rome because Rome had basically executed Order 66. Just like they did with the Jedi and basically turned on the African power there. And that was a war. All that stuff is to cover up the fact that you had these African people fighting to take back Rome, which rightfully belonged to them. And they don't even try to hide it too much now when they start talking about the Black Caesars and everything like that and the rulers of Rome during that time. You can't hide the stuff. I mean, they're right there. And it's easy for you to piece this stuff together. I mean, we can't let these people get away with stealing our history. So you need to know it. And this is one of the reasons I'm putting out this series so you can know the stories and know the actual history. So when it's time for you to talk about it, you done heard the truth, you know the story, you know what's up. This is a very important DVD, very important information and video that I really just saved you guys a lot of time and effort trying to piece together and figure out exactly what happened and where to go to get the truth. The books that popped up that you've seen is books you need to read and understand, but not really, because this is the story in a nutshell. It's a lot more history to go with it. It's a lot more Ptolemies, a lot more Alexanders, a lot more wars that happened with the Diadochi for a long time. And these people slaughtering each other for the throne. Now, if you follow me on Instagram and on my Facebook page, I talked about the Masonic Bible that I have here. This Hallman Masonic Bible that was given to me by a Mason friend of mine. And in it you have Masonic Bible. And, it's a little bit different in some ways from the King James Version. It's a really good edition. And we're going to get into this. And there's actually another Masonic Bible on the way from a Masonic friend of mine that's older. That's a better version than this. But this is good to have to compare with actual King James versions for you to piece together this information. But we're going to get into this stuff because the history is really important. It's really important to know and to see what happened. And we're going to really get into these kingdoms in Africa that I always talk about that rose up, why they rose up, how they rose up, and exactly what they was doing when we start getting into this ancient history. This part is really important to know because you're going to see how it fits later on. And, these kingdoms, these Africans that fled the war and were smart enough to get out of there with this information. And I guess they sat back and watched the Greeks destroy each other, and they figured, well, they're going to wipe each other out. Let's just, do what we do, and they had no clue. A lot of them had no clue. A lot of people was wiped out, and a lot of people was killed during this time. A lot of people died, a lot of Africans. And you would think when they took over Kemet, because they were smart in how they did this, but you were thinking when they took over Kemet that the Africans that did escape would go into lower Africa and really warn everybody about the Europeans and what they was doing and how they was taking over. Again, the biggest thing is we had no unity back then. Unity would have saved us. And you would think that once that happened, no European could come into a African kingdom and take over. So they were smart in how they did it. And, it's tough to push unity now because so many people have opinions. And it's hard for us to come together because we got opinions. But I believe that if everybody take care of themselves, take care of you, take care of your family, try to put out information and help whoever you can, but really focus on you, then we'll be fine. If you're conscious and you can help somebody else become conscious, and if all of us become conscious as individuals, the rest will work itself out. Because us trying to say, let's come together and let's unite, it's not going to happen. We're going to keep butting heads. People are going to keep coming in with their ideologies and their religions and their opinions and their facts and what they believe to be right and true. But if you're conscious, if you take the time personally to get the information, then you'll be fine. And if you can encourage others to do the same, to get the information personally, they'll be fine. So on and so forth. Everybody in a rush to prove the next person wrong. The debates was good. It's a good thing for the debates to come out and for people to really debate biblical religion and to understand what's going on. But the debates became more like, hip hop rap battles to some people and not so much about the person who loses converting. I will be all for the debates. I would debate a lot if it meant that if I proved my point over you, that you would convert. Not even convert, just accept the information, accept the truth. And that's not what's happening. It just makes a person more angry, at, the person with the truth, with the facts. And that's what happens. So I try not to really debate people so much when I'm debating, when I'm actually doing it. My point I like to get across is that this is information that is the truth. I'm not trying to play you in no way. I want you to really accept this information and understand it and really just do your own research. When you got the truth and you got history on your side, you can say that. These people, these Hebrews and these Christians kicking this stuff, they're not saying to you, go do your own research. All they can say is, go read the Bible. It's in the Bible. Read the book. Because if you go do your own research, they know you ain't going to read their book the same anymore. Plain and simple. They understand that. So history is really important to understand and to know where this stuff fits at as far as the history of African people. So now, I'm not really endorsing the Apocrypha, the Deuterocanonical books. When you read Baal and the Dragon, even still, like these books being out of the King James Version conflict with the King James Version. It contradicts. Like even with Baal and the Dragon, with Daniel, it gives two different reasons why Daniel was thrown in the lion's den. It differs from the actual King James Version. Because remember with Baal and the Dragon, Daniel was basically saying that, there is no dragon, really. No dragon is actually coming in there. It's people that's faking this whole thing. And they come up with like a scheme to basically put food on the table. So basically, if the dragon eats the food and the food is gone in the morning, then Daniel, gets killed. So Daniel was smart and he put like coal on the floor. And then in the morning they go in there and, the food is gone. So he's ready to be like, you're dead. But then they look and see the coal marks leading to these people who basically was the ones who ate the food, who was perpetrating the whole lie. And, those people get killed and Daniel lived. But basically the people, it's like they were so beloving of the story of the dragon being real and everything like that they was mad at Daniel and they wanted to throw him into the lion's den. So that's one version. Then of course you have the other version where you have them basically saying that nobody go to anybody else for, prophecies or what have you, but to like the king or what have you. And of course you have Daniel praying to God and everything like that. So he was thrown into the lion's den. So you have two different stories. So you have magical things and a lot of different stuff that's in the Apocrypha that really just kills the Bible. It's like, what is this stuff doing? What is this stuff about? It contradicts it in so many different ways. And again, they know and don't expect you to read it as a whole for you to figure this stuff out. So, what I'm saying for you to understand is, it's like when I say, if you just read the book, there's no way you can read the book and accept this stuff as actual fact, history. So it's just crazy. The message just stands out to you when you read it and you understand what it's talking about. But if you don't know actual history, it's just no way. If you don't know about the occult, you don't know about any esoteric books or knowledge, you would never put this stuff together. As I said, you can only go as far as what you know. If I put a riddle, a puzzle in front of you, or, just some information for you to decipher, you can only decipher it based on what you were told. If you don't get no new outside information to help you figure out this puzzle, you'll never figure it out. You can only go by what you know. And that's basically what happened with us when we start accepting these doctrines and books. We went by what we know. A lot of people don't know about riddles and decipherment and what have you, and parables and everything like that. We look at this stuff and we read it and we say, oh, it is what it is. And we go by how we was taught in the church. And that's how they wanted to go. So if you're not willing to accept the outside information and to learn it and to take it in, you're going to continue to be fooled by, what they put out. And again, I wanted to get this out because it's important information. It's going to help us as we go along. And it's a lot more to this that's just so deep. It's so deep, but we're going to get into it. We're going to crack everything open. And I did this series specifically for this reason, because I didn't want this history to not be known. And when we get into, because we're going to also get into the Syriac, the Peshitta, and everything that's going on. Again, was just talking about Antiochus II in Syria. So what that whole thing is about, remember they said they called it Christianity in Antioch. Remember that in the Bible. I believe it's Acts 11:2 or something like that. But in Acts, remember, it's talking about, it was first called Christianity in Antioch. Think about that. And you have Antiochus. And you have that whole thing going on with the who? Greeks. The Greeks. The oldest synagogue or Jewish synagogue in the world is where? It's in Delos, in Greece. So all the stuff is pointing right to the Greeks and showing you who are the ones who created this whole biblical deception. But you can also see, and what I wanted to point out, is where they get a lot of their stories from. A lot of their movies and TV shows come straight out of the Bible, which come from real historical events that happen, that they are smart enough to finagle and switch around. And for those in the occult to be able to look at it and say, okay, he talked about the Ptolemies, this is good job. And that's what they do. And now, because you've seen this, you can see how they do it. And because you watch a lot of my videos, you see what they're doing. And that's what it's about. That's really what it's about. If you are into this esoteric stuff and into this information, you can piece it out like we just did. And you can figure it out. But this is what they do. Plain and simple. They get kicks out of it. They do it for whatever reason. But it has to do with altering our consciousness and many other things. But we see what they're doing. And we know this stuff comes from a history. Somebody's history. So finally, again, It's important for us to understand history, especially our history and true history, so we are not accepting the lie into our consciousness as a fact. Because once it's in us, it's in us. It's in us, and we believe in it, and we think it's true, and we putting this energy out there as if it's true when we know they lie. History is a lie, and it's important for us to know. And they're going to hide. Of course, they're going to hide the Ptolemaic era, this history that I just given to you. You're not going to really get it all. It's a lot more to it, as I said, but it's important for you to understand and know it and get it into you as being the truth of what really happened and what was going on. It's not so much as being meaningless information. It's important. Remember, as I said before, one of their biggest plans that when you start following this stuff back, that they was going to do, that they was going to try to come out and declare themselves as the bloodline or relatives of Jesus, to try to push their whole New World Order agenda, what have you. This is something that a lot of people was talking about, in I believe like it's the 40s and 50s. And a lot of people who understood, this stuff is not new, this whole Illuminati thing. And there's a lot of people that was into this information for a long time. But they had already was talking about how the Bavarian Illuminati was supposed to have come out and push the Rothschild family as being the Holy Family. And they still call them the Holy Family, as being the heir of Jesus Christ. What really that means is their bloodline goes back to the Ptolemies. It goes back to these people who set this stuff in place. And that's basically what it is, because they are the ones who created, Jesus and all this other bullcrap. It's their bloodline. It's the same thing. It's just time is passing. And when you start to really think about how long ago this was, you got to really, it gets deep, as I talked about in many videos. But wanted to get into this and get this piece of history out, because it's going to fit with part 3 so well, and so many other things that we're going to get into. That's really important to understand this part, and understand that, during that time, when you look at the territories that they crowned themselves kings of, it's everything. It's the Middle East, it's Europe, Egypt, and we see how they shifted their power and spread it over to Northern Africa, Spain, and what have you. It's really important, because you see the beginning of their conquest right there, plain and simple. And it's no way you can get around that. You see it right there, clear as day. But you got to trace it all the way back and see where it stemmed from, and see that these people ain't just get divinely put in positions of power as kings and queens by God, as the Bible would have you believe. Talking about in Romans how God put them in place. They were ordained by God to basically be the powers that be. So now you understand how, of course, we know they conquered their way onto the throne. They took over with deception and murder, rape, torture, bribery, whatever you want to add to it. And that's why they are in power. And because we had such a good nature about us. We was kind. We wanted to help. We couldn't fathom that they would do what they've done to us, and we wasn't united, which is the main part. They took over, plain and simple, and we're still dealing with it. And this information is just tip of the iceberg. We got a lot to get into, but I want to thank you guys for being patient on this one and let me get through this story and get this out there, because it's important. And I appreciate the support and everybody who's been supporting and not really complaining too much about anything. It's getting a lot busy for me. I have a lot going on personally. So, I want to get out as much as possible. I have a lot of plans for 2018, a lot of major things I'm trying to do. I really have a lot that, if I put my foot down and work hard this year, 2019, 2020, I set myself up to be in a really good position financially. And I really be able to do a lot, because my focus is really on my site, as I talked about. I really want to get that going. We need that. We need a platform for us that's internet based, that we can really use and pour resources to get a lot out of social media, and out of the internet. We can't let them have this. Like, we got to understand how important this is. And I talked about my stuff being censored. I showed you guys, and how, you know, some of my videos on YouTube has been censored and taken down. It's really important, as I talked about before, that we get our foot in somewhere before it's too late. Trust me on this one. We don't want to miss the boat on this one. It's important to get our foot in somewhere and have some kind of stable ground as African Americans, as black people in this internet before they take it over. Because if we don't, we are so screwed for the future. And I don't think people really understand that. And I don't really want to get too much into it and put videos out on it too much, because I don't want, you know, that kind of information to get out. As far as me understanding what I understand, it's not really good. But we got to just do. We got to act and do what we need to do and show these corporations and companies that we are not with censorship, especially when it comes to our history and information that we need to know. We got to fight for that. Plain and simple. I talked about how I wanted to just promote this video that was basically, poking fun at Christianity. And Facebook won't even accept money to promote a video that's already circulating on Facebook. You can share it all you want, but if you want to pay to boost it so people can see it, like, you know, all around, they won't let you do that. That's serious. That's telling you how it's getting. So we really got to get our foot in the door and really start establishing, everybody, each one of us, more websites and things that is like really geared towards holding on to this information and our history before it's gone. And we got to keep spreading it and teaching it to each other and to our children before it's gone, before it's censored, before they get to a point. Because this is what they want to do. They want to get to a point where they can say, oh, you teasing white folks, so we're not going to let you promote that. Oh, you teasing black folks, so we're not going to let you promote that. That's where we're headed. So while we jumping on the bandwagon on all this, as I talked about in the video that's about to come out on YouTube, we're jumping on the bandwagon of all this, coolest monkey in the jungle and all this touchy-feely stuff, not knowing what we asking for. Y'all don't get what they doing. They present a problem and then present the solution. So all this stuff we getting so touchy-feely about, eventually they're going to say, well, guess what? You're not allowed to put this out because it's offensive to the black people. You're not allowed to put this out. It's offensive to the Arabs and the Muslims. You're not allowed to put this out because it's offensive to white folks. So when we try to talk about our history and what really happened to us, guess what? It's going to be offensive to white folks. So you can't talk about it. This is what we're headed. This is what we're headed to. Understand what they're doing and how they work and how they move. We can't let it happen. So we got to have our sites, our freedom of speech, our way to not be stuck in their platform where they control what we can say and what we can put out. Is very important. This history is important and we got to know it. Plain and simple. So again, thanks for your support. Thanks for taking the time to watch and understanding what I'm trying to do. And, I really appreciate it, guys. And I'll see you guys next video. Thanks for watching.